transition to democracy is not complete. At the moment, Nepal is undergoing a unique moment in its history because it is moving towards the formation of a constituent assembly that will write the constitution for Nepal. Some sections in Nepal still think that a nominal monarchy is necessary for Nepal to retain its link with the past. The Maoist groups have agreed to suspend armed struggle. They want the constitution to include the radical programs of social and economic restructuring. All the parties in the SPA may not agree with this program. The Maoists and some other political groups are also deeply suspicious of the Indian government and its role in the future of Nepal. Ethnic conflict and democracy in Sri Lanka. We have already seen that Sri Lanka has retained democracy since its independence in 1948. But it faced a serious challenge, not from the military or monarchy but rather from ethnic conflict leading to the demand for secession by one of the regions. After its independence, politics in Sri Lanka, it was then known as Ceylon, was dominated by forces that represented the interest of the majority Sinhala community. They were hostile to a large number of Tamils who had migrated from India to Sri Lanka and settled there. This migration continued even after independence. The Sinhala nationalists thought that Sri Lanka should not give concessions to the Tamils because Sri Lanka belongs to the Sinhala people only. The neglect of Tamil concerns led to militant Tamil nationalism. From 1983 onwards, the militant organization, the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam (LTTE), has been fighting an armed struggle with the army of Sri Lanka and demanding Tamil Eelam, or a separate country for the Tamils of Sri Lanka. The LTTE controls the northeastern parts of Sri Lanka. The Sri Lankan problem involves people of Indian origin, and there is considerable pressure from the Tamil people in India to the effect that the Indian government should protect the interests of the Tamils in Sri Lanka. The government of India has from time to time tried to negotiate with the Sri Lankan government on the Tamil question. But in 1987, the government of India for the first time got directly involved in the Sri Lankan Tamil question. India signed an accord with Sri Lanka and sent troops to stabilize relations between the Sri Lankan government and the Tamils. Eventually, the Indian army got into a fight with the LTTE. The presence of Indian troops was also not liked much by the Sri Lankans. They saw this as an attempt by India to interfere in the internal affairs of Sri Lanka. In 1989, the Indian Peacekeeping Force, IPKF, pulled out of Sri Lanka without attaining its objective. The Sri Lankan crisis continues to be violent. However, international actors, particularly the Scandinavian countries such as Norway and Iceland, have been trying to bring the warring groups back to negotiations. The future of the island hinges on the outcome of these talks. In spite of the ongoing conflict, Sri Lanka has registered considerable economic growth and recorded high levels of human development. Sri Lanka was one of the first developing countries to successfully control the rate of growth of population, the first country in the region to liberalize the economy, and it has had the highest per capita gross domestic product (GDP) for many years right through the Civil War. Despite the ravages of internal conflict, it has maintained a democratic political system. India-Pakistan conflicts. Let us now move from domestic politics and take a look at some of the areas of conflict in the international relations in this region. The post-Cold War era has not meant the end of conflicts and tensions in this region. We have already noted the conflicts around internal democracy or ethnic differences. But there are also some very crucial conflicts of an international nature. Given the position of India in this region, most of these conflicts involve India. The most salient and overwhelming of these conflicts is, of course, the one between India and Pakistan. Soon after the partition, the two countries got embroiled in a conflict over the fate of Kashmir. The Pakistani government claimed that Kashmir belonged to it. Wars between India and Pakistan in 1947 to 1948 and 1965 failed to settle the matter. The 1947-48 war resulted in the division of the province into Pakistan-occupied Kashmir and the Indian province of Jammu and Kashmir divided by the line of control. In 1971, India won a decisive war against Pakistan, but the Kashmir issue remained unsettled. India's conflict with Pakistan is also over strategic issues like the control of the Siachen Glacier and over acquisition of arms. The arms race between the two countries assumed a new character, with both states acquiring nuclear weapons and missiles to deliver such arms against each other in the 1990s. In 1998, India conducted nuclear explosion in Pokhran. Pakistan responded within a few days by carrying out nuclear tests in the Chagay Hills. Since then, India and Pakistan seem to have built a military relationship in which the possibility of a direct and full-scale war has declined. But both the governments continue to be suspicious of each other. The Indian government has blamed the Pakistan government for using a strategy of low-key violence by helping the Kashmiri militants with arms, training, money and protection to carry out terrorist strikes against India. The Indian government also believes that Pakistan had aided the pro-Khalistani militants with arms and ammunitions during the period 1985 to 1995. Its spy agency, Inter-Services Intelligence (ISI), is alleged to be involved in various anti-India campaigns in India's northeast, operating secretly through Bangladesh and Nepal. The government of Pakistan, in turn, blames the Indian government and its security agencies for fomenting trouble in the provinces of Sindh and Balochistan. India and Pakistan also have had problems over the sharing of river waters. Until 1960, they were locked in a fierce argument over the use of the rivers of the Indus Basin. Eventually, in 1960, with the help of the World Bank, India and Pakistan signed the Indus Waters Treaty, which has survived to this day in spite of various military conflicts in which the two countries have been involved. There are still some minor differences about the interpretation of the Indus Waters Treaty and the use of the river waters. The two countries are not in agreement over the demarcation line in Sir Creek in the Rann of Kutch. The dispute seems minor, but there is an underlying worry that how the dispute is settled may have an impact on the control of sea resources in the area adjoining Sir Creek. India and Pakistan are holding negotiations on all these issues. India and its other neighbors, the governments of India and Bangladesh, have had differences over several issues, including the sharing of the Ganga and Brahmaputra river waters. The Indian government has been unhappy with Bangladesh denial of illegal immigration to India, its support for anti-Indian Islamic fundamentalist groups, Bangladesh refusal to allow Indian troops to move through its territory to northeastern India, and its decision not to export natural gas to India or allow Myanmar to do so through Bangladeshi territory. Bangladeshi governments have felt that the Indian government behaves like a regional bully over the sharing of river waters, encouraging rebellion in the Chittagong Hill Tracts, trying to extract its natural gas and being unfair in trade. The two countries have not succeeded in resolving their boundary dispute. Despite their differences, India and Bangladesh do cooperate on many issues. Economic relations have improved considerably in the last 10 years. Bangladesh is a part of India's Look East policy that wants to link up with Southeast Asia via Myanmar. On disaster management and environmental issues, the two states have cooperated regularly. Efforts are on to broaden the areas of cooperation further by identifying common threats and being more sensitive to each other's needs. Nepal and India enjoy a very special relationship that has very few parallels in the world. A treaty between the two countries allows the citizens of the two countries to travel to and work in the other country without visas and passports. Despite this special relationship, the governments of the two countries have had trade-related disputes in the past. The Indian government has often expressed displeasure at the warm relationship between Nepal and China and at the Nepal government's inaction against anti-Indian elements. Indian security agencies see the Maoist movement in Nepal as a growing security threat, Given the rise of Naxalite groups in various Indian states from Bihar in the north to Andhra Pradesh in the south, many leaders and citizens in Nepal think that the Indian government interferes in its internal affairs, has designs on its river waters and hydroelectricity, and prevents Nepal, a landlocked country, from getting easier access to the sea through Indian territory. Nevertheless, Indo-Nepal relations are fairly stable and peaceful. Despite differences, trade, scientific cooperation, common natural resources, electricity generation and interlocking water management grids hold the two countries together. There is a hope that the consolidation of democracy in Nepal will lead to improvements in the ties between the two countries. The difficulties in the relationship between the governments of India and Sri Lanka are mostly over ethnic conflict in the island nation. Indian leaders and citizens find it impossible to remain neutral when Tamils are politically unhappy and are being killed. After the military intervention in 1987, the Indian government now prefers a policy of disengagement vis-a-vis Sri Lanka's internal troubles. India signed a free trade agreement with Sri Lanka, which strengthened relations between two countries. India's help in post-tsunami reconstruction in Sri Lanka has also brought the two countries closer. India enjoys a very special relationship with Bhutan too and does not have any major conflict with the Bhutanese government. The efforts made by the Bhutanese monarch to weed out the guerrillas and militants from northeastern India that operate in his country have been helpful to India. India is involved in big hydroelectric projects in Bhutan and remains the Himalayan kingdom's biggest source of development aid. India's ties with the Maldives remain warm and cordial. In November 1988, when some Tamil mercenaries from Sri Lanka attacked the Maldives, the Indian Air Force and Navy reacted quickly to the Maldives' request to help stop the invasion. India has also contributed towards the island's economic development, tourism and fisheries. You may have noticed that India has various problems with its smaller neighbors in the region. Given its size and power, they are bound to be suspicious of India's intentions. The Indian government, on the other hand, often feels exploited by its neighbors. It does not like the political instability in these countries, fearing it can help outside powers to gain influence in the region. The smaller countries fear that India wants to be a regionally dominant power. Not all conflicts in South Asia are between India and its neighbors. Nepal and Bhutan, as well as Bangladesh and Myanmar, have had disagreements in the past over the migration of ethnic Nepalese into Bhutan and the Rohingyas into Myanmar, respectively. Bangladesh and Nepal have had some differences over the future of the Himalayan river waters. The major conflicts and differences, though, are between India and the others, partly because of the geography of the region, in which India is located centrally and is therefore the only country that borders the others. Peace and cooperation. Do the states of South Asia cooperate with each other? Or do they only keep fighting with each other? In spite of the many conflicts, the states of South Asia recognize the importance of cooperation and friendly relationship among themselves. The South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation (SAARC) is a major regional initiative by the South Asian states to evolve cooperation through multilateral means. It began in 1985. Unfortunately, due to persisting political differences, SAARC has not had much success. SAARC members signed the South Asian Free Trade (SAFTA) agreement, which promised the formation of a free trade zone for the whole of South Asia. A new chapter of peace and cooperation might evolve in South Asia if all the countries in the region allow free trade across the borders. This is the spirit behind the idea of SAFTA. The agreement was signed in 2004 and came into effect on the 1st of January 2006. SAFTA aims at lowering trade tariffs by 20% by 2007. But some of our neighbors fear that SAFTA is a way for India to invade their markets and to influence their societies and politics through commercial ventures and a commercial presence in their countries. India thinks that there are real economic benefits for all from SAFTA and that a region that trades more freely will be able to cooperate better on political issues. Some in India think that SAFTA is not worth the trouble since India already has bilateral agreements with Bhutan, Nepal and Sri Lanka. Although India-Pakistan relations seem to be a story of endemic conflict and violence, there have been a series of efforts to manage tensions and build peace. The two countries have agreed to undertake confidence-building measures to reduce the risk of war. Social activists and prominent personalities have collaborated to create an atmosphere of friendship among the people of both countries. Leaders have met at summits to understand each other better and to find solutions to the major problems between the two neighbors. A number of bus routes have been opened up between the two countries. Trade between the two parts of Punjab has increased substantially in the last 5 years. Visas have been more easily given. No region exists in a vacuum. It is influenced by outside powers and events no matter how much it may try to insulate itself from non-regional powers. China and the United States remain key players in South Asian politics. Sino-Indian relations have improved significantly in the last 10 years, but China's strategic partnership with Pakistan remains a major irritant. The demands of development and globalization have brought the two Asian giants closer, and their economic ties have multiplied rapidly since 1991. American involvement in South Asia has rapidly increased after the Cold War. The US has had good relations with both India and Pakistan since the end of the Cold War and increasingly works as a moderator in India-Pakistan relations. Economic reforms and liberal economic policies in both countries have greatly increased the depth of American participation in the region. The large South Asian diasporas in the US and the huge size of the population and markets of the region also give America an added stake in the future of regional security and peace. However, whether South Asia will continue to be known as a conflict-prone zone or will evolve into a regional bloc with some common cultural features and trade interests will depend more on people and of the region than any other outside power. Timeline of South Asia since 1947. 1947, India and Pakistan emerge as independent nations after the end of British rule. 1948, Sri Lanka, then Ceylon, gains independence, Indo-Pak conflict over Kashmir. 1954-55, Pakistan joins the Cold War military blocs, SEATO and CENTO. 1960 September, India and Pakistan sign the Indus Waters Treaty. 1962, border conflict between India and China. 1965, Indo-Pak War, Un-India-Pakistan Observation Mission 1966, India and Pakistan sign the Tashkent Agreement, 6-point proposal of Sheikh Mujibur Rahman for greater autonomy to East Pakistan. 1971 March, Proclamation of Independence by leaders of Bangladesh. August, Indo-Soviet Treaty of Friendship signed for 20 years. December, Indo-Pak War, Liberation of Bangladesh 1972 July, India and Pakistan sign the Shimla Agreement 1974 May, India conducts nuclear test. 1976, Pakistan and Bangladesh establish diplomatic relations. 1985 December, South Asian leaders sign the SAARC Charter at the first summit in Dhaka. 1987, Indo-Sri Lanka Accord, Indian Peacekeeping Force, IPKF, operation in Sri Lanka, 1987-1990. 1988, India sends troops to the Maldives to foil a coup attempt by mercenaries. India and Pakistan sign the agreement not to attack nuclear installations and facilities of each other. 1988-1991, democracy restoration in Pakistan, Bangladesh and Nepal. 1996 December, India and Bangladesh sign the Farrakha Treaty for sharing of the Ganga waters. 1998 May, India and Pakistan conduct nuclear tests. December, India and Sri Lanka sign the Free Trade Agreement, FTA. 1999 February, Indian PM Vajpayee undertakes bus journey to Lahore to sign a peace declaration. June-July, Kargil conflict between India and Pakistan 2001 July, Vajpayee-Musharraf Agra summit unsuccessful. 2004 January, SAFTA signed at the 12th SAARC Summit in Islamabad. Chapter 6 International Organizations Overview. In this chapter we shall discuss the role of international organizations after the collapse of the Soviet Union. We shall examine how, in this emerging world, there were calls for the restructuring of international organizations to cope with various new challenges, including the rise of its power, the potential reform of the United Nations Security Council is an interesting case of the reform process and its difficulties. We then turn to India's involvement in the UN and its view of Security Council reforms. The chapter closes by asking if the UN can play any role in dealing with a world dominated by one superpower. In this chapter we also look at some other transnational organizations that are playing a crucial role. Why international organizations? Read the two cartoons on this page. Both the cartoons comment on the ineffectiveness of the United Nations organization, usually referred to as the UN, in the Lebanon crisis in 2006. Both the cartoons represent the kind of opinions that we often hear about the UN. On the other hand, we also find that the UN is generally regarded as the most important international organization in today's world. In the eyes of many people all over the world, it is indispensable and represents the great hope of humanity for peace and progress. Why do we then need organizations like the UN? Let us hear two insiders. The United Nations was not created to take humanity to heaven, but to save it from hell. Dag Hammarskjöld, the UN's Second Secretary General. Talking shop. Yes, there are a lot of speeches and meetings at the UN, especially during the annual sessions of the General Assembly. But as Churchill put it, jaw is better than war. Is not it better to have one place where all countries in the world can get together, bore each other sometimes with their words rather than bore holes into each other on the battlefield? Shashi Tharoor, the former UN Under-Secretary General for Communications and Public Information. These two quotes suggest something important. International organizations are not the answer to everything, but they are important. International organizations help with matters of war and peace. They also help countries cooperate to make better living conditions for us all. Countries have conflicts and differences with each other. That does not necessarily mean they must go to war to deal with their antagonisms. They can, instead, discuss contentious issues and find peaceful solutions. Indeed, even though this is rarely noticed, most conflicts and differences are resolved without going to war. The role of an international organization can be important in this context. An international organization is not a superstate with authority over its members. It is created by and responds to states. It comes into being when states agree to its creation. Once created, it can help member states resolve their problems peacefully. International organizations are helpful in another way. Nations can usually see that there are some things they must do together. There are issues that are so challenging that they can only be dealt with when everyone works together. Disease is an example. Some diseases can only be eradicated if everyone in the world cooperates in inoculating or vaccinating their populations. Or take global warming and its effects. As atmospheric temperatures rise because of the spread of certain chemicals called chlorofluorocarbons, CFCs, there is a danger that sea levels will also rise, thereby submerging many coastal areas of the world including huge cities. Of course, each country can try to find its own solution to the effects of global warming. But in the end a more effective approach is to stop the warming itself. This requires at least all of the major industrial powers to cooperate. Unfortunately, recognizing the need for cooperation and actually cooperating are two different things. Nations can recognize the need to cooperate but cannot always agree on how best to do so, how to share the costs of cooperating, how to make sure that the benefits of cooperating are justly divided, and how to ensure that others do not break their end of the bargain and cheat on an agreement. An international organization can help produce information and ideas about how to cooperate. It can provide mechanisms, rules and a bureaucracy, to help members have more confidence that costs will be shared properly, that the benefits will be fairly divided, and that once a member joins an agreement it will honor the terms and conditions of the agreement. With the end of the Cold War, we can see that the UN may have a slightly different role. As the United States and its allies emerged victorious, there was concern amongst many governments and peoples that the Western countries led by the US would be so powerful that there would be no check against their wishes and desires. Can the UN serve to promote dialogue and discussion with the US in particular, and could it limit the power of the American government? We shall try to answer this question at the end of the chapter. Evolution of the UN. The First World War encouraged the world to invest in an international organization to deal with conflict. Many believed that such an organization would help the world to avoid war. As a result, the League of Nations was born. However, despite its initial success, it could not prevent the Second World War, 1939 to 1945. Many more people died and were wounded in this war than ever before. The UN was founded as a successor to the League of Nations. It was established in 1945 immediately after the Second World War. The organization was set up through the signing of the United Nations Charter by 51 states. It tried to achieve what the League could not between the two world wars. The UN's objective is to prevent international conflict and to facilitate cooperation among states. It was founded with the hope that it would act to stop the conflicts between states escalating into war and, if war broke out, to limit the extent of hostilities. Furthermore, since conflicts often arose from the lack of social and economic development, the UN was intended to bring countries together to improve the prospects of social and economic development all over the world. By 2006, the UN had 192 member states. These included almost all independent states. In the UN General Assembly, all members have one vote each. In the UN Security Council, there are 5 permanent members. These are the United States, Russia, the United Kingdom, France and China. These states were selected as permanent members as they were the most powerful immediately after the Second World War and because they constituted the victors in the war. The UN's most visible public figure, and the representative head, is the Secretary General. The present Secretary General is Ban Ki-moon from South Korea. He is the 8th Secretary General of the UN. He took over as the Secretary General on the 1st of January 2007. He is the first Asian to hold the post since 1971. The UN consists of many different structures and agencies. War and peace and differences between member states are discussed in the General Assembly as well as the Security Council. Social and economic issues are dealt with by many agencies including the World Health Organization, WHO, the United Nations Development Programme, UNDP, the United Nations Human Rights Commission, UNHRC, the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, UNHCR, the United Nations Children's Fund, UNICEF, and the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, UNESCO, among others. Reform of the UN. After the Cold War, reform and improvement are fundamental to any organization to serve the needs of a changing environment. The UN is no exception. In recent years, there have been demands for reform of the world body. However, there is little clarity and consensus on the nature of reform. 2 basic kinds of reforms face the UN: reform of the organization's structures and processes, and a review of the issues that fall within the jurisdiction of the organization. Almost everyone is agreed that both aspects of reform are necessary. What they cannot agree on is precisely what is to be done, how it is to be done, and when it is to be done. On the reform of structures and processes, the biggest discussion has been on the functioning of the Security Council. Related to this has been the demand for an increase in the UN Security Council's permanent and non-permanent membership so that the realities of contemporary world politics are better reflected in the structure of the organization. In particular, there are proposals to increase membership from Asia, Africa and South America. Beyond this, the US and other Western countries want improvements in the UN's budgetary procedures and its administration. On the issues to be given greater priority or to be brought within the jurisdiction of the UN, some countries and experts want the organization to play a greater or more effective role in peace and security missions, while others want its role to be confined to development and humanitarian work, health, education, environment, population control, human rights, gender and social justice. Let us look at both sets of reforms, with an emphasis on reform of the structures and processes. The UN was established in 1945 immediately after the Second World War. The way it was organized and the way it functioned reflected the realities of world politics after the Second World War. After the Cold War, those realities are different. Here are some of the changes that have occurred. The Soviet Union has collapsed. The US is the strongest power. The relationship between Russia, the successor to the Soviet Union, and the US is much more cooperative. China is fast emerging as a great power, and India also is growing rapidly. The economies of Asia are growing at an unprecedented rate. Many new countries have joined the UN, as they became independent from the Soviet Union or former communist states in Eastern Europe. A whole new set of challenges confronts the world: genocide, civil war, ethnic conflict, terrorism, nuclear proliferation, climate change, environmental degradation, epidemics. In this situation, in 1989, as the Cold War was ending, the question facing the world was, is the UN doing enough? Is it equipped to do what is required? What should it be doing? And how? What reforms are necessary to make it work better? For the past decade and a half, member states have been trying to find satisfactory and practical answers to these questions. Reform of structures and processes. While the case for reform has widespread support, getting agreement on what to do is difficult. Let us examine the debate over reform of the UN Security Council. In 1992, the UN General Assembly adopted a resolution. The resolution reflected three main complaints: the Security Council no longer represents contemporary political realities. Its decisions reflect only Western values and interests and are dominated by a few powers. It lacks equitable representation. In view of these growing demands for the restructuring of the UN, on the 1st of January 1997, the UN Secretary-General Kofi Annan initiated an inquiry into how the UN should be reformed. How, for instance, should new Security Council members be chosen? In the years since then, the following are just some of the criteria that have been proposed for new permanent and non-permanent members of the Security Council. A new member, it has been suggested, should be a major economic power, a major military power, a substantial contributor to the UN budget, a big nation in terms of its population, a nation that respects democracy and human rights, a country that would make the Council more representative of the world's diversity in terms of geography, economic systems, and culture. Clearly, each of these criteria has some validity. Governments saw advantages in some criteria and disadvantages in others depending on their interests and aspirations. Even if they had no desire to be members themselves, countries could see that the criteria were problematic. How big an economic or military power did you have to be to qualify for Security Council membership? What level of budget contribution would enable a state to buy its way into the Council? Was a big population an asset or a liability for a country trying to play a bigger role in the world? If respect for democracy and human rights was the criteria, countries with excellent records would be in line to be members, but would they be effective as Council members? Furthermore, how was the matter of representation to be resolved? Did equitable representation in geographical terms mean that there should be one seat each from Asia, Africa, and Latin America and the Caribbean? Should the representation, on the other hand, be by regions or subregions, rather than continents? Why should the issue of equitable representation be decided by geography? Why not by levels of economic development? Why not, in other words, give more seats to members of the developing world. Even here, there are difficulties. The developing world consists of countries at many different levels of development. What about culture? Should different cultures or civilizations be given representation in a more balanced way? How does one divide the world by civilizations or cultures given that nations have so many cultural streams within their borders? A related issue was to change the nature of membership altogether. Some insisted, for instance, that the veto power of the 5 permanent members be abolished. Many perceived the veto to be in conflict with the concept of democracy and sovereign equality in the UN and thought that the veto was no longer right or relevant. In the Security Council, there are 5 permanent members and 10 non-permanent members. The Charter gave the permanent members a privileged position to bring about stability in the world after the Second World War. The main privileges of the 5 permanent members are permanency and the veto power. The non-permanent members serve for only 2 years at a time and give way after that period to newly elected members. A country cannot be re-elected immediately after completing a term of 2 years. The non-permanent members are elected in a manner so that they represent all continents of the world. Most importantly, the non-permanent members do not have the veto power. What is the veto power? In taking decisions, the Security Council proceeds by voting. All members have 1 vote. However, the permanent members can vote in a negative manner so that even if all other permanent and non-permanent members vote for a particular decision, any permanent member's negative vote can stall the decision. This negative vote is the veto. While there has been a move to abolish or modify the veto system, there is also a realization that the permanent members are unlikely to agree to such a reform. Also, the world may not be ready for such a radical step even though the Cold War is over. Without the veto, there is the danger as in 1945 that the great powers would lose interest in the world body, that they would do what they pleased outside it, and that without their support and involvement the body would be ineffective. Jurisdiction of the UN. The question of membership is a serious one. In addition, though, there are more substantial issues before the world. As the UN completed 60 years of its existence, the heads of all the member states met in September 2005 to celebrate the anniversary and review the situation. The leaders in this meeting decided that the following steps should be taken to make the UN more relevant in the changing context. Creation of a peace-building commission. Acceptance of the responsibility of the international community in case of failures of national governments to protect their own citizens from atrocities. Establishment of a Human Rights Council, operational since the 19th of June 2006. Agreements to achieve the Millennium Development Goals. Condemnation of terrorism in all its forms and manifestations. Creation of a democracy fund. An agreement to wind up the Trusteeship Council. It is not hard to see that these are equally contentious issues for the UN. What should a peace-building commission do? There are any number of conflicts all over the world. Which ones should it intervene in? Is it possible or even desirable for it to intervene in each and every conflict? Similarly, what is the responsibility of the international community in dealing with atrocities? What are human rights and who should determine the level of human rights violations and the course of action to be taken when they are violated? Given that so many countries are still part of the developing world, how realistic is it for the UN to achieve an ambitious set of goals such as those listed in the Millennium Development Goals? Can there be agreement on a definition of terrorism? How shall the UN use funds to promote democracy? And so on. India and the UN reforms. India has supported the restructuring of the UN on several grounds. It believes that a strengthened and revitalized UN is desirable in a changing world. India also supports an enhanced role for the UN in promoting development and cooperation among states. India believes that development should be central to the UN's agenda as it is a vital precondition for the maintenance of international peace and security. One of India's major concerns has been the composition of the Security Council, which has remained largely static while the UN General Assembly membership has expanded considerably. India considers that this has harmed the representative character of the Security Council. It also argues that an expanded council, with more representation, will enjoy greater support in the world community. We should keep in mind that the membership of the UN Security Council was expanded from 11 to 15 in 1965. But there was no change in the number of permanent members. Since then, the size of the council has remained stationary. The fact remains that the overwhelming majority of the UN General Assembly members now are developing countries. Therefore, India argues that they should also have a role in shaping the decisions in the Security Council which affect them. India supports an increase in the number of both permanent and non-permanent members. Its representatives have argued that the activities of the Security Council have greatly expanded in the past few years. The success of the Security Council's actions depends upon the political support of the international community. Any plan for restructuring of the Security Council should, therefore, be broad-based. For example, the Security Council should have more developing countries in it. Not surprisingly, India itself also wishes to be a permanent member in a restructured UN. India is the second most populous country in the world, comprising almost 1/5 of the world population. Moreover, India is also the world's largest democracy. India has participated in virtually all of the initiatives of the UN. Its role in the UN's peacekeeping efforts is a long and substantial one. The country's economic emergence on the world stage is another factor that perhaps justifies India's claim to a permanent seat in the Security Council. India has also made regular financial contributions to the UN and never faltered on its payments. India is aware that permanent membership of the Security Council also has symbolic importance. It signifies a country's growing importance in world affairs. This greater status is an advantage to a country in the conduct of its foreign policy. The reputation for being powerful makes you more influential. Despite India's wish to be a permanent veto-wielding member of the UN, some countries question its inclusion. Neighboring Pakistan, with which India has troubled relations, is not the only country that is reluctant to see India become a permanent veto member of the Security Council. Some countries, for instance, are concerned about India's nuclear weapons capability, the UN or any other international organization. Secondly, within the UN, the influence of the IS is considerable. As the single largest contributor to the UN, the IS has unmatched financial power. The fact that the UN is physically located within the IS territory gives Washington additional sources of influence. The IS also has many nationals in the UN bureaucracy. In addition, with its veto power, the IS can stop any moves that it finds annoying or damaging to its interests or the interests of its friends and allies. The power of the IS and its veto within the organization also ensure that Washington has a considerable degree of say in the choice of the Secretary General of the UN. The IS can and does use this power to split the rest of the world and to reduce opposition to its policies. The UN is not therefore a great balance to the IS. Nevertheless, in a unipolar world in which the IS is dominant, the UN can and has served to bring the IS and the rest of the world into discussions over various issues. As leaders, in spite of their frequent criticism of the UN, do see the organization as serving a purpose in bringing together over 190 nations and dealing with conflict and social and economic development. As for the rest of the world, the UN provides an arena in which it is possible to modify its attitudes and policies. While the rest of the world is rarely united against Washington, and while it is virtually impossible to balance as power, the UN does provide a space within which arguments against specific IS attitudes and policies are heard and compromises and concessions can be shaped. The UN is an imperfect body, but without it the world would be worse off. Given the growing connections and links between societies and issues, what we often call interdependence, it is hard to imagine how more than 7 billion people would live together without an organization such as the UN. Technology promises to increase planetary interdependence, and therefore the importance of the UN will only increase. Peoples and governments will have to find ways of supporting and using the UN and other international organizations in ways that are consistent with their own interests and the interests of the international community more broadly. Human Rights Watch is another international GO involved in research and advocacy on human rights. It is the largest international human rights organization in the US. It draws the global media's attention to human rights abuses. It helped in building international coalitions like the campaigns to ban landmines, to stop the use of child soldiers, and to establish the International Criminal Court. IMF. The International Monetary Fund (IMF) is an international organization that oversees those financial institutions. Regulations that act at the international level. The IMF has 184 members countries, but they do not enjoy an equal say. The top 10 countries have 55% of the votes. They are the G8 members, the US, Japan, Germany, France, the UK, Italy, Canada and Russia, Saudi Arabia and China. The US alone has 17.4% voting rights. Founding of the United Nations 1941 August, signing of the Atlantic Charter by the US President Franklin D. Roosevelt and British PM Winston S. Churchill 1942 January, 26 Allied nations fighting against the Axis powers meet in Washington, D.C., to support the Atlantic Charter and sign the Declaration by United Nations 1943 December, Tehran Conference Declaration of the Three Powers, US, Britain and Soviet Union, 1945 February, Yalta Conference of the Big Three, Roosevelt, Churchill and Stalin, decides to organize a United Nations conference on the proposed World Organization April-May, the 2-month-long United Nations Conference on International Organization at San Francisco 1945 June 26, signing of the UN Charter by 50 nations. Poland signed on October 15, so the UN has 51 original founding members. 1945 October 24, the UN was founded, hence October 24 is celebrated as UN Day. 1945 October 30, India joins the UN Secretaries General Trygve Lie. 1946 to 1952, Norway, lawyer and foreign minister, worked for ceasefire between India and Pakistan on Kashmir. Criticized for his failure to quickly end the Korean War, Soviet Union opposed second term for him, resigned from the post. Dag Hammarskjöld, 1953 to 1961, Sweden, economist and lawyer, worked for resolving the Suez Canal dispute and the decolonization of Africa, awarded Nobel Peace Prize posthumously in 1961 for his efforts to settle the Congo crisis. Soviet Union and France criticized his role in Africa. Youth Ant, 1961 to 1971, Burma, Myanmar, teacher and diplomat, worked for resolving the Cuban Missile Crisis and ending the Congo crisis, established the UN peacekeeping force in Cyprus, criticized the US during the Vietnam War. Kurt Waldheim, 1972 to 1981, Austria, diplomat and foreign minister, made efforts to resolve the problems of Namibia and Lebanon, oversaw the relief operation in Bangladesh. China blocked his bid for a third term. Javier Perez de Cuellar, 1982 to 1991, Peru, lawyer and diplomat, worked for peace in Cyprus, Afghanistan and El Salvador, mediated between Britain and Argentina after the Falklands War, negotiated for the independence of Namibia. Boutros Ghali, 1992 to 1996, Egypt, diplomat, jurist, foreign minister, issued a report, An Agenda for Peace, conducted a successful UN operation in Mozambique, blamed for the UN failures in Bosnia, Somalia and Rwanda. Due to serious disagreements, the US blocked a second term for him. Kofi Annan, 1997 to 2006, Ghana, unofficial, created the Global Fund to fight AIDS, tuberculosis and malaria, declared the US led invasion of Iraq as an illegal act, established the Peace-Building Commission and the Human Rights Council in 2005, awarded the 2001 Nobel Peace Prize. WTO. The World Trade Organization, WTO, is an international organization which sets the rules for global trade. This organization was set up in 1995 as the successor to the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, GATT, created after the Second World War. It has 150 members. All decisions are taken unanimously, but the major economic powers such as the US, EU and Japan have managed to use the WTO to frame rules of trade to advance their own interests. The developing countries often complain of non-transparent procedures and being pushed around by big powers. IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, (IAEA), was established in 1957. It came into being to implement as President Dwight Eisenhower's Atoms for Peace proposal. It seeks to promote the peaceful use of nuclear energy and to prevent its use for military purposes. IAEA teams regularly inspect nuclear facilities all over the world to ensure that civilian reactors are not being used for military purposes. Amnesty International is an NGO that campaigns for the protection of human rights all over the world. It promotes respect for all the human rights in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It believes that human rights are interdependent and indivisible. It prepares and publishes reports on human rights. Governments are not always happy with these reports since a major focus of Amnesty is the misconduct of government authorities. Nevertheless, these reports play an important role in research and advocacy on human rights. Chapter 7 Security in the Contemporary World Overview. In reading about world politics, we frequently encounter the terms security or national security. Do we know what these terms mean? Often, they are used to stop debate and discussion. We hear that an issue is a security issue and that it is vital for the well-being of the country. The implication is that it is too important or secret to be debated and discussed openly. We see movies in which everything surrounding national security is shadowy and dangerous. Security seems to be something that is not the business of the ordinary citizen. In a democracy, surely this cannot be the case. As citizens of a democracy, we need to know more about the term security. What exactly is it? And what are India's security concerns? This chapter debates these questions. It introduces two different ways of looking at security and highlights the importance of keeping in mind different contexts or situations which determine our view of security. What is security? At its most basic, security implies freedom from threats. Human existence and the life of a country are full of threats. Does that mean that every single threat counts as a security threat? Every time a person steps out of his or her house, there is some degree of threat to their existence and way of life. Our world would be saturated with security issues if we took such a broad view of what is threatening. Those who study security, therefore, generally say that only those things that threaten core values should be regarded as being of interest in discussions of security. Whose core values though? The core values of the country as a whole. The core values of ordinary women and men in the street. Do governments, on behalf of citizens, always have the same notion of core values as the ordinary citizen? Furthermore, when we speak of threats to core values, how intense should the threats be? Surely there are big and small threats to virtually every value we hold dear. Can all those threats be brought into the understanding of security? Every time another country does something or fails to do something, this may damage the core values of one's country. Every time a person is robbed in the streets, the security of ordinary people as they live their daily lives is harmed. Yet, we would be paralyzed if we took such an extensive view of security. Everywhere we looked, the world would be full of dangers. So we are brought to a conclusion: security relates only to extremely dangerous threats, threats that could so endanger core values that those values would be damaged beyond repair if we did not do something to deal with the situation. Having said that, we must admit that security remains a slippery idea. For instance, have societies always had the same conception of security? It would be surprising if they did, because so many things change in the world around us. And, at any given time in world history, do all societies have the same conception of security? Again, it would be amazing if 650 crore people, organized in nearly 200 countries, had the same conception of security. Let us begin by putting the various notions of security under two groups: traditional and non-traditional conceptions of security. Traditional notions, external most of the time. When we read and hear about security, we are talking about traditional, national security conceptions of security. In the traditional conception of security, the greatest danger to a country is from military threats. The source of this danger is another country which by threatening military action endangers the core values of sovereignty, independence and territorial integrity. Military action also endangers the lives of ordinary citizens. It is unlikely that in a war only soldiers will be hurt or killed. Quite often, ordinary men and women are made targets of war, to break their support of the war. In responding to the threat of war, a government has three basic choices: to surrender, to prevent the other side from attacking by promising to raise the costs of war to an unacceptable level, and to defend itself when war actually breaks out so as to deny the attacking country its objectives and to turn back or defeat the attacking forces altogether. Governments may choose to surrender when actually confronted by war, but they will not advertise this as the policy of the country. Therefore, security policy is concerned with preventing war, which is called deterrence, and with limiting or ending war, which is called defense. Traditional security policy has a third component called balance of power. When countries look around them, they see that some countries are bigger and stronger. This is a clue to who might be a threat in the future. For instance, a neighboring country may not say it is preparing for attack. There may be no obvious reason for attack. But the fact that this country is very powerful is a sign that at some point in the future it may choose to be aggressive. Governments are, therefore, very sensitive to the balance of power between their country and other countries. They do work hard to maintain a favorable balance of power with other countries, especially those close by, those with whom they have differences, or with those they have had conflicts in the past. A good part of maintaining a balance of power is to build up one's military power, although economic and technological power are also important since they are the basis for military power. A fourth and related component of traditional security policy is alliance building. An alliance is a coalition of states that coordinate their actions to deter or defend against military attack. Most alliances are formalized in written treaties and are based on a fairly clear identification of who constitutes the threat. Countries form alliances to increase their effective power relative to another country or alliance. Alliances are based on national interests and can change when national interests change. For example, the IS backed the Islamic militants in Afghanistan against the Soviet Union in the 1980s, but later attacked them when Al-Qaeda, a group of Islamic militants led by Osama bin Laden, launched terrorist strikes against America on the 11th of September 2001. In the traditional view of security, then, most threats to a country's security come from outside its borders. That is because the international system is a rather brutal arena in which there is no central authority capable of controlling behavior. Within a country, the threat of violence is regulated by an acknowledged central authority, the government. In world politics, there is no acknowledged central authority that stands above everyone else. It is tempting to think that the United Nations is such an authority or could become such an institution. However, as presently constituted, the UN is a creature of its members and has authority only to the extent that the membership allows it to have authority and obeys it. So, in world politics, each country has to be responsible for its own security. Traditional notions, internal. By now you will have asked yourself, does not security depend on internal peace and order? How can a society be secure if there is violence or the threat of violence inside its borders? And how can it prepare to face violence from outside its borders if it is not secure inside its borders? Traditional security must also, therefore, concern itself with internal security. The reason it is not given so much importance is that after the Second World War it seemed that, for the most powerful countries on Earth, internal security was more or less assured. We said earlier that it is important to pay attention to contexts and situations. While internal security was certainly a part of the concerns of governments historically, after the Second World War there was a context and situation in which internal security did not seem to matter as much as it had in the past. After 1945, the US and the Soviet Union appeared to be united and could expect peace within their borders. Most of the European countries, particularly the powerful Western European countries, faced no serious threats from groups or communities living within those borders. Therefore, these countries focused primarily on threats from outside their borders. What were the external threats facing these powerful countries? Again, we draw attention to contexts and situations. We know that the period after the Second World War was the Cold War in which the US-led Western Alliance faced the Soviet Communist Alliance. Above all, the two alliances feared a military attack from each other. Some European powers, in addition, continued to worry about violence in their colonies, from colonized people who wanted independence. We have only to remember the French fighting in Vietnam in the 1950s or the British fighting in Kenya in the 1950s and the early 1960s. As the colonies became free from the late 1940s onwards, their security concerns were often similar to that of the European powers. Some of the newly independent countries, like the European powers, became members of the Cold War alliances. They, therefore, had to worry about the Cold War becoming a hot war and dragging them into hostilities against neighbors who might have joined the other side in the Cold War, against the leaders of the alliances, the United States or Soviet Union, or against any of the other partners of the US and Soviet Union. The Cold War between the two superpowers was responsible for approximately a third of all wars in the post-Second World War period. Most of these wars were fought in the Third World. Just as the European colonial powers feared violence in the colonies, some colonial people feared, after independence, that they might be attacked by their former colonial rulers in Europe. They had to prepare, therefore, to defend themselves against an imperial war. The security challenges facing the newly independent countries of Asia and Africa were different from the challenges in Europe in two ways. For one thing, the new countries faced the prospect of military conflict with neighboring countries. For another, they had to worry about internal military conflict. These countries faced threats not only from outside their borders, mostly from neighbors, but also from within. Many newly independent countries came to fear their neighbors even more than they feared the US or Soviet Union or the former colonial powers. They quarreled over borders and territories or control of people and populations or all of these simultaneously. Internally, the new states worried about threats from separatist movements which wanted to form independent countries. Sometimes, the external and internal threats merged. A neighbor might help or instigate an internal separatist movement leading to tensions between the two neighboring countries. Internal wars now make up more than 95% of all armed conflicts fought anywhere in the world. Between 1946 and 1991, there was a 12-fold rise in the number of civil wars, the greatest jump in 200 years. So, for the new states, external wars with neighbors and internal wars posed a serious challenge to their traditional security and cooperation. In traditional security, there is a recognition that cooperation in limiting violence is possible. These limits relate both to the ends and the means of war. It is now an almost universally accepted view that countries should only go to war for the right reasons, primarily self-defense or to protect other people from genocide. War must also be limited in terms of the means that are used. Armies must avoid killing or hurting non-combatants as well as unarmed and surrendering combatants. They should not be excessively violent. Force must in any case be used only after all the alternatives have failed. Traditional views of security do not rule out other forms of cooperation as well. The most important of these are disarmament, arms control, and confidence building. Disarmament requires all states to give up certain kinds of weapons. For example, the 1972 Biological Weapons Convention (BWC) and the 1992 Chemical Weapons Convention (CWC) banned the production and possession of these weapons. More than 155 states acceded to the BWC and 181 states acceded to the CWC. Both conventions included all the great powers. But the superpowers, the US and Soviet Union, did not want to give up the third type of weapons of mass destruction, namely, nuclear weapons, so they pursued arms control. Arms control regulates the acquisition or development of weapons. The Anti-Ballistic Missile (ABM) Treaty in 1972 tried to stop the United States and Soviet Union from using ballistic missiles as a defensive shield to launch a nuclear attack. While it did allow both countries to deploy a very limited number of defensive systems, it stopped them from large-scale production of those systems. As we noted in Chapter 1, the US and Soviet Union signed a number of other arms control treaties including the Strategic Arms Limitations Treaty or SALT and the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty (START). The Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty (NPT) of 1968 was an arms control treaty in the sense that it regulated the acquisition of nuclear weapons. Those countries that had tested and manufactured nuclear weapons before 1967 were allowed to keep their weapons, and those that had not done so were to give up the right to acquire them. The NPT did not abolish nuclear weapons, rather, it limited the number of countries that could have them. Traditional security also accepts confidence building as a means of avoiding violence. Confidence building is a process in which countries share ideas and information with their rivals. They tell each other about their military intentions and, up to a point, their military plans. This is a way of demonstrating that they are not planning a surprise attack. They also tell each other about the kind of forces they possess, and they may share information on where those forces are deployed. In short, confidence building is a process designed to ensure that rivals do not go to war through misunderstanding or misperception. Overall, traditional conceptions of security are principally concerned with the use, or threat of use, of military force. In traditional security, force is both the principal threat to security and the principal means of achieving security. Non-traditional notions of security go beyond military threats to include a wide range of threats and dangers affecting the conditions of human existence. They begin by questioning the traditional referent of security. In doing so, they also question the other three elements of security: what is being secured, from what kind of threats, and the approach to security. When we say referent, we mean security for who. In the traditional security conception, the referent is the state with its territory and governing institutions. In the non-traditional conceptions, the referent is expanded. When we ask security for who, proponents of non-traditional security reply, not just the state but also individuals or communities or indeed all of humankind. Non-traditional views of security have been called human security or global security. Human security is about the protection of people more than the protection of states. Human security and state security should be, and often are, the same thing. But secure states do not automatically mean secure peoples. Protecting citizens from foreign attack may be a necessary condition for the security of individuals, but it is certainly not a sufficient one. Indeed, during the last 100 years, more people have been killed by their own governments than by foreign armies. All proponents of human security agree that its primary goal is the protection of individuals. However, there are differences about precisely what threats individuals should be protected from. Proponents of the narrow concept of human security focus on violent threats to individuals or, as former Undersecretary General Kofi Annan puts it, the protection of communities and individuals from internal violence. Proponents of the broad concept of human security argue that the threat agenda should include hunger, disease and natural disasters because these kill far more people than war, genocide and terrorism combined. Human security policy, they argue, should protect people from these threats as well as from violence. In its broadest formulation, the human security agenda also encompasses economic security and threats to human dignity. Put differently, the broadest formulation stresses what has been called freedom from want and freedom from fear, respectively. The idea of global security emerged in the 1990s in response to the global nature of threats such as global warming, international terrorism, and health epidemics like AIDS and bird flu and so on. No country can resolve these problems alone. And, in some situations, one country may have to disproportionately bear the brunt of a global problem such as environmental degradation. For example, due to global warming, a sea level rise of 1.5-2.0 meters would flood 20% of Bangladesh, inundate most of the Maldives, and threaten nearly half the population of Thailand. Since these problems are global in nature, international cooperation is vital, even though it is difficult to achieve. New sources of threats. The non-traditional conceptions, both human security and global security, focus on the changing nature of threats to security. We will discuss some of these threats in the section below. Terrorism refers to political violence that targets civilians deliberately and indiscriminately. International terrorism involves the citizens or territory of more than one country. Terrorist groups seek to change a political context or condition that they do not like by force or threat of force. Civilian targets are usually chosen to terrorize the public and to use the unhappiness of the public as a weapon against national governments or other parties in conflict. The classic cases of terrorism involve hijacking planes or planting bombs in trains, cafes, markets and other crowded places. Since the 11th of September 2001 when terrorists attacked the World Trade Center in America, other governments and public have paid more attention to terrorism, though terrorism itself is not new. In the past, most of the terror attacks have occurred in the Middle East, Europe, Latin America and South Asia. Human rights have come to be classified into three types. The first type is political rights such as freedom of speech and assembly. The second type is economic and social rights. The third type is the rights of colonized people or ethnic and indigenous minorities. While there is broad agreement on this classification, there is no agreement on which set of rights should be considered as universal human rights, nor what the international community should do when rights are being violated. Since the 1990s, developments such as Iraq's invasion of Kuwait, the genocide in Rwanda, and the Indonesian military's killing of people in East Timor have led to a debate on whether or not the UN should intervene to stop human rights abuses. There are those who argue that the UN Charter empowers the international community to take up arms in defense of human rights. Others argue that the national interests of the powerful states will determine which instances of human rights violations the UN will act upon. Global poverty is another source of insecurity. World population, now at 650 crore, will reach 700 to 800 crore within 25 years and may eventually level out at 900 to 1,000 crore. Currently, half the world's population growth occurs in just 6 countries: India, China, Pakistan, Nigeria, Bangladesh and Indonesia. Among the world's poorest countries, population is expected to triple in the next 50 years, whereas many rich countries will see population shrinkage in that period. High per capita income and low population growth make rich states or rich social groups get richer, whereas low incomes and high population growth reinforce each other to make poor states and poor groups get poorer. Globally, this disparity contributes to the gap between the northern and southern countries of the world. Within the South, disparities have also sharpened, as a few countries have managed to slow down population growth and raise incomes while others have failed to do so. For example, most of the world's armed conflicts now take place in sub-Saharan Africa, which is also the poorest region of the world. At the turn of the 21st century, more people were being killed in wars in this region than in the rest of the world combined. Poverty in the South has also led to large-scale migration to seek a better life, especially better economic opportunities, in the North. This has created international political frictions. International law and norms make a distinction between migrants, those who voluntarily leave their home countries, and refugees, those who flee from war, natural disaster or political persecution. States are generally supposed to accept refugees, but they do not have to accept migrants. While refugees leave their country of origin, people who have fled their homes but remain within national borders are called internally displaced people. Kashmiri Pandits that fled the violence in the Kashmir Valley in the early 1990s are an example of an internally displaced community. The World Refugee Map tallies almost perfectly with the World Conflicts Map because wars and armed conflicts in the South have generated millions of refugees seeking safe haven. From 1990 to 1995, 70 states were involved in 93 wars which killed about 55 lakh people. As a result, individuals and families and, at times, whole communities have been forced to migrate because of generalized fear of violence or due to the destruction of livelihoods, identities and living environments. A look at the correlation between wars and refugee migration shows that in the 1990s, all but 3 of the 60 refugee flows coincided with an internal armed conflict. Health epidemics such as HIV AIDS, bird flu, and severe acute respiratory syndrome, SARS, have rapidly spread across countries through migration, business, tourism and military operations. One country's success or failure in limiting the spread of these diseases affects infections in other countries. By 2003, an estimated 4 crore people were infected with HIV/AIDS worldwide, 2/3 of them in Africa and half of the rest in South Asia. In North America and other industrialized countries, new drug therapies dramatically lowered the death rate from HIV/AIDS in the late 1990s. But these treatments were too expensive to help poor regions like Africa, where it has proved to be a major factor in driving the region backward into deeper poverty. Other new and poorly understood diseases such as Ebola virus, hantavirus, and hepatitis C have emerged, while old diseases like tuberculosis, malaria, dengue fever and cholera have mutated into drug-resistant forms that are difficult to treat. Epidemics among animals have major economic effects. Since the late 1990s, Britain has lost billions of dollars of income during an outbreak of the mad cow disease, and bird flu shut down supplies of poultry exports from several Asian countries. Such epidemics demonstrate the growing interdependence of states, making their borders less meaningful than in the past and emphasize the need for international cooperation. Expansion of the concept of security does not mean that we can include any kind of disease or distress in the ambit of security. If we do that, the concept of security stands to lose its coherence. Everything could become a security issue. To qualify as a security problem, therefore, an issue must share a minimum common criterion, say, of threatening the very existence of the referent, a state or group of people, though the precise nature of this threat may be different. For example, the Maldives may feel threatened by global warming because a big part of its territory may be submerged with the rising sea level, whereas for countries in southern Africa, HIV/AIDS poses a serious threat as 1 in 6 adults has the disease, 1 in 3 for Botswana, the worst case. In 1994, the Tutsi tribe in Rwanda faced a threat to its existence as nearly 5 lakh of its people were killed by the rival Hutu tribe in a matter of weeks. This shows that non-traditional conceptions of security, like traditional conceptions of security, vary according to local contexts. Cooperative security: we can see that dealing with many of these non-traditional threats to security require cooperation rather than military confrontation. Military force may have a role to play in combating terrorism or in enforcing human rights, and even here there is a limit to what force can achieve, but it is difficult to see what force would do to help alleviate poverty, manage migration and refugee movements, and control epidemics. Indeed, in most cases, the use of military force would only make matters worse. Far more effective is to devise strategies that involve international cooperation. Cooperation may be bilateral, i.e., between any two countries, regional, continental, or global. It would all depend on the nature of the threat and the willingness and ability of countries to respond. Cooperative security may also involve a variety of other players, both international and national. International organizations, the UN, the World Health Organization, the World Bank, the IMF, etc., non-governmental organizations, Amnesty International, the Red Cross, private foundations and charities, churches and religious organizations, trade unions, associations, social and development organizations, businesses and corporations, and great personalities, e.g. Mother Teresa, Nelson Mandela. Cooperative security may involve the use of force as a last resort. The international community may have to sanction the use of force to deal with governments that kill their own people or ignore the misery of their populations who are devastated by poverty, disease and catastrophe. It may have to agree to the use of violence against international terrorists and those who harbor them. Non-traditional security is much better when the use of force is sanctioned and applied collectively by the international community rather than when an individual country decides to use force on its own. India's security strategy. India has faced traditional, military, and non-traditional threats to its security that have emerged from within as well as outside its borders. Its security strategy has 4 broad components, which have been used in a varying combination from time to time. The first component was strengthening its military capabilities because India has been involved in conflicts with its neighbors, Pakistan in 1947-48, 1965, 1971 and 1999, and China in 1962. Since it is surrounded by nuclear-armed countries in the South Asian region, India's decision to conduct nuclear tests in 1998 was justified by the Indian government in terms of safeguarding national security. India first tested a nuclear device in 1974. The second component of India's security strategy has been to strengthen international norms and international institutions to protect its security interests. India's first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, supported the cause of Asian solidarity, decolonization, disarmament, and the UN as a forum in which international conflicts could be settled. India also took initiatives to bring about a universal and non-discriminatory non-proliferation regime in which all countries would have the same rights and obligations with respect to weapons of mass destruction, nuclear, biological, chemical. It argued for an equitable new international economic order, NIEO. Most importantly, it used non-alignment to help carve out an area of peace outside the bloc politics of the two superpowers. India joined 160 countries that have signed and ratified the 1997 Kyoto Protocol, which provides a roadmap for reducing the emissions of greenhouse gases to check global warming. Indian troops have been sent abroad on peacekeeping missions in support of cooperative security initiatives. The third component of Indian security strategy is geared towards meeting security challenges within the country. Several militant groups from areas such as the Nagaland, Mizoram, the Punjab, and Kashmir among others have, from time to time, sought to break away from India. India has tried to preserve national unity by adopting a democratic political system, which allows different communities and groups of people to freely articulate their grievances and share political power. Finally, there has been an attempt in India to develop its economy in a way that the vast mass of citizens are lifted out of poverty and misery and huge economic inequalities are not allowed to exist. The attempt has not quite succeeded. We are still a very poor and unequal country. Yet democratic politics allows spaces for articulating the voice of the poor and the deprived citizens. There is a pressure on the democratically elected governments to combine economic growth with human development. Thus, democracy is not just a political ideal, a democratic government is also a way to provide greater security. You will read more about the successes and failures of Indian democracy in this respect in the textbook on politics in India since independence. Chapter 8 Environment and Natural Resources Overview. This chapter examines the growing significance of environmental as well as resource issues in world politics. It analyses in a comparative perspective some of the important environmental movements against the backdrop of the rising profile of environmentalism from the 1960s onwards. Notions of common property resources and the global commons too are assessed. We also discuss, in brief, the stand taken by India in more recent environmental debates. Next follows a brief account of the geopolitics of resource competition. We conclude by taking note of the indigenous peoples' voices and concerns from the margins of contemporary world politics. Environmental concerns in global politics. In this book we have discussed world politics in a fairly limited sense, wars and treaties, rise and decline of state power, the relationship between the governments that represent their countries in the international arena and the role of intergovernmental organizations. In Chapter 7, we expanded the scope of world politics to include issues like poverty and epidemics. That may not have been a very difficult step to take, for we all think that governments are responsible for controlling these. In that sense they fall within the scope of world politics. Now consider some other issues. Do you think they fall within the scope of contemporary world politics? Throughout the world, cultivable area is barely expanding anymore, and a substantial portion of existing agricultural land is losing fertility. Grasslands have been overgrazed and fisheries overharvested. Water bodies have suffered extensive depletion and pollution, severely restricting food production. According to the Human Development Report 2006 of the United Nations Development Programme, 1.2 billion people in developing countries have no access to safe water and 2.6 billion have no access to sanitation, resulting in the death of more than 3 million children every year. Natural forests, which help stabilize the climate, moderate water supplies, and harbor a majority of the planet's biodiversity on land, are being cut down and people are being displaced. The loss of biodiversity continues due to the destruction of habitat in areas which are rich in species. A steady decline in the total amount of ozone in the Earth's stratosphere, commonly referred to as the ozone hole, poses a real danger to ecosystems and human health. Coastal pollution too is increasing globally. Although the open sea is relatively clean, the coastal waters are becoming increasingly polluted largely due to land-based activities. If unchecked, intensive human settlement of coastal zones across the globe will lead to further deterioration in the quality of marine environment. You might ask, are we not talking here about natural phenomena that should be studied in geography rather than in political science? But think about it again. If the various governments take steps to check environmental degradation of the kind mentioned above, these issues will have political consequences in that sense. Most of them are such that no single government can address them fully. Therefore they have to become part of world politics. Issues of environment and natural resources are political in another deeper sense. Who causes environmental degradation? Who pays the price? And who is responsible for taking corrective action? Who gets to use how much of the natural resources of the earth? All these raise the issue of who wields how much power. They are, therefore, deeply political questions. Although environmental concerns have a long history, awareness of the environmental consequences of economic growth acquired an increasingly political character from the 1960s onwards. The Club of Rome, a global think tank, published a book in 1972 entitled Limits to Growth, dramatizing the potential depletion of the Earth's resources against the backdrop of rapidly growing world population. International agencies, including the United Nations Environment Programme, UNEP, began holding international conferences and promoting detailed studies to get a more coordinated and effective response to environmental problems. Since then, the environment has emerged as a significant issue of global politics. The growing focus on environmental issues within the arena of global politics was firmly consolidated at the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development held in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, in June 1992. This was also called the Earth Summit. The summit was attended by 170 states, thousands of NGOs and many multinational corporations. 5 years earlier, the 1987 Brundtland Report, Our Common Future, had warned that traditional patterns of economic growth were not sustainable in the long term, especially in view of the demands of the South for further industrial development. What was obvious at the Rio Summit was that the rich and developed countries of the First World, generally referred to as the Global North, were pursuing a different environmental agenda than the poor and developing countries of the Third World, called the Global South. Whereas the northern states were concerned with ozone depletion and global warming, the southern states were anxious to address the relationship between economic development and environmental management. The Rio Summit produced conventions dealing with climate change, biodiversity, forestry, and recommended a list of development practices called Agenda 21. But it left unresolved considerable differences and difficulties. There was a consensus on combining economic growth with ecological responsibility. This approach to development is commonly known as sustainable development. The problem, however, was how exactly this was to be achieved. Some critics have pointed out that Agenda 21 was biased in favor of economic growth rather than ensuring ecological conservation. Let us look at some of the contentious issues in the global politics of environment. The protection of global commons. Commons are those resources which are not owned by anyone but rather shared by a community. This could be a common room, a community center, a park or a river. Similarly, there are some areas or regions of the world which are located outside the sovereign jurisdiction of any one state, and therefore require common governance by the international community. These are known as res communis humanitatis or global commons. They include the Earth's atmosphere, Antarctica, sea box, the ocean floor, and outer space. Cooperation over the global commons is not easy. There have been many path-breaking agreements such as the 1959 Antarctic Treaty, the 1987 Montreal Protocol, and the 1991 Antarctic Environmental Protocol. A major problem underlying all ecological issues relates to the difficulty of achieving consensus on common environmental agendas on the basis of vague scientific evidence and time frames. In that sense, the discovery of the ozone hole over the Antarctic in the mid-1980s revealed the opportunity as well as dangers inherent in tackling global environmental problems. Similarly, the history of outer space as a global commons shows that the management of these areas is thoroughly influenced by north-south inequalities. As with the Earth's atmosphere and the ocean floor, the crucial issue here is technology and industrial development. This is important because the benefits of exploitative activities in outer space are far from being equal either for the present or future generations. Common but differentiated responsibility. We have noted above a difference in the approach to environment between the countries of the North and the South. The developed countries of the North want to discuss the environmental issue as it stands now and want everyone to be equally responsible for ecological conservation. The developing countries of the South feel that much of the ecological degradation in the world is the product of industrial development undertaken by the developed countries. If they have caused more degradation, they must also take more responsibility for undoing the damage now. Moreover, the developing countries are in the process industrialization and they must not be subjected to the same restrictions, which apply to the developed countries. Thus, the special needs of the developing countries must be taken into account in the development, application, and interpretation of rules of international environmental law. This argument was accepted in the Rio Declaration at the Earth Summit in 1992 and is called the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. The relevant part of the Rio Declaration says that states shall cooperate in the spirit of global partnership to conserve, protect and restore the health and integrity of the Earth's ecosystem. In view of the different contributions of global environmental degradation, states have common but differentiated responsibilities. The developed countries acknowledge the responsibility that they bear in the international pursuit of sustainable development in view of the pressures their societies place on the global environment and of the technological and financial resources they command. The 1992 United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change (UNFCCC) also provides that the parties should act to protect the climate system on the basis of equity and in accordance with their common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. The parties to the convention agreed that the largest share of historical and current global emissions of greenhouse gases has originated in developed countries. It was also acknowledged that per capita emissions in developing countries are still relatively low. China, India, and other developing countries were, therefore, exempted from the requirements of the Kyoto Protocol. The Kyoto Protocol is an international agreement setting targets for industrialized countries to cut their greenhouse gas emissions. Certain gases like carbon dioxide, methane, hydrofluorocarbons, etc., are considered at least partly responsible for global warming, the rise in global temperature which may have catastrophic consequences for life on Earth. The protocol was agreed to in 1997 in Kyoto in Japan, based on principles set out in UNFCCC. Common property resources. Common property represents common property for the group. The underlying norm here is that members of the group have both rights and duties with respect to the nature, levels of use, and the maintenance of a given resource. Through mutual understanding and centuries of practice, many village communities in India, for example, have defined members' rights and responsibilities. A combination of factors, including privatization, agricultural intensification, population growth and ecosystem degradation, have caused common property to dwindle in size, quality, and availability to the poor in much of the world. The institutional arrangement for the actual management of the sacred groves on state-owned forest land appropriately fits the description of a common property regime. Along the forest belt of South India, sacred groves have been traditionally managed by village communities. India's stand on environmental issues. India signed and ratified the 1997 Kyoto Protocol in August 2002. India, China and other developing countries were exempt from the requirements of the Kyoto Protocol because their contribution to the emission of greenhouse gases during the industrialization period, that is believed to be causing today's global warming and climate change, was not significant. However, the critics of the Kyoto Protocol point out that sooner or later, both India and China, along with other developing countries, will be among the leading contributors to greenhouse gas emission. At the G8 meeting in June 2005, India pointed out that the per capita emission rates of the developing countries are a tiny fraction of those in the developed world. Following the principle of common but differentiated responsibility, India is of the view that the major responsibility of curbing emission rests with the developed countries, which have accumulated emissions over a long period of time. India's international negotiating position relies heavily on principles of historical responsibility, as enshrined in UNFCCC. This acknowledges that developed countries are responsible for most historical and current greenhouse emissions, and emphasizes that economic and social development are the first and overriding priorities of the developing country parties. So India is wary of recent discussions within UNFCCC about introducing binding commitments on rapidly industrializing countries, such as Brazil, China and India, to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. India feels this contravenes the very spirit of UNFCCC. Neither does it seem fair to impose restrictions on India when the country's rise in per capita carbon emissions by 2030 is likely to still represent less than half the world average of 3.8 tons in 2000. Indian emissions are predicted to rise from 0.9 tons per capita in 2000 to 1.6 tons per capita in 2030. The Indian government is already participating in global efforts through a number of programs. For example, India's national auto fuel policy mandates cleaner fuels for vehicles. The Energy Conservation Act, passed in 2001, outlines initiatives to improve energy efficiency. Similarly, the Electricity Act of 2003 encourages the use of renewable energy. Recent trends in importing natural gas and encouraging the adoption of clean coal technologies show that India has been making real efforts. The government is also keen to launch a national mission on biodiesel, using about 11 million hectares of land to produce biodiesel by 2011-2012. And India has one of the largest renewable energy programs in the world. A review of the implementation of the agreements at the Earth Summit in Rio was undertaken by India in 1997. One of the key conclusions was that there had been no meaningful progress with respect to transfer of new and additional financial resources and environmentally sound technology on concessional terms to developing nations. India finds it necessary that developed countries take immediate measures to provide developing countries with financial resources and clean technologies to enable them to meet their existing commitments under UNFCCC. India is also of the view that the SAARC countries should adopt a common position on major global environment issues, so that the region's voice carries greater weight. Environmental movements, one or many. We have, so far, looked at the way governments have reacted at the international level to the challenge of environmental degradation. But some of the most significant responses to this challenge have come not from the governments but rather from groups of environmentally conscious volunteers working in different parts of the world. Some of them work at the international level, but most of them work at the local level. These environmental movements are amongst the most vibrant, diverse, and powerful social movements across the globe today. It is within social movements that new forms of political action are born or reinvented. These movements raise new ideas and long-term visions of what we should do and what we should not do in our individual and collective lives. Here are just a few examples to show that diversity is an important trait of contemporary environmental movements. The forest movements of the South, in Mexico, Chile, Brazil, Malaysia, Indonesia, continental Africa and India, just to list a few examples, are faced with enormous pressures. Forest clearing in the Third World continues at an alarming rate, despite 3 decades of environmental activism. The destruction. World's last remaining grand forests has actually increased in the last decade. The minerals industry is one of the most powerful forms of industry on the planet. A large number of economies of the South are now being reopened to MNCs through the liberalization of the global economy. The mineral industry's extraction of earth, its use of chemicals, its pollution of waterways and land, its clearance of native vegetation, its displacement of communities, amongst other factors, continue to invite criticism and resistance in various parts of the globe. One good example is that of the Philippines, where a vast network of groups and organizations campaigned against the Western Mining Corporation, WMC, an Australia-based multinational company. Much opposition to the company in its own country, Australia, is based on anti-nuclear sentiments and advocacy for the basic rights of Australian Indigenous peoples. Another group of movements are those involved in struggles against megadams. In every country where a megadam is being built, one is likely to find an environmental movement opposing it. Increasingly anti-dam movements are pro-river movements for more sustainable and equitable management of river systems and valleys. The early 1980s saw the first anti-dam movement launched in the north, namely, the campaign to save the Franklin River and its surrounding forests in Australia. This was a wilderness and forest campaign as well as anti-dam campaign. At present, there has been a spurt in megadam building in the south, from Turkey to Thailand to South Africa, from Indonesia to China. India has had some of the leading anti-dam, pro-river movements. Narmada Bachao Andolan is one of the best known of these movements. It is significant to note that, in anti-dam and other environmental movements in India, the most important shared idea is non-violence. Resource geopolitics is all about who gets what, when, where and how. Resources have provided some of the key means and motives of global European power expansion. They have also been the focus of interstate rivalry. Western geopolitical thinking about resources has been dominated by the relationship of trade, war and power, at the core of which were overseas resources and maritime navigation. Since sea power itself rested on access to timber, naval timber supply became a key priority for major European powers from the 17th century onwards. The critical importance of ensuring uninterrupted supply of strategic resources, in particular oil, was well established both during the First World War and the Second World War. Throughout the Cold War, the industrialized countries of the North adopted a number of methods to ensure a steady flow of resources. These included the deployment of military forces near exploitation sites and along sea lines of communication, the stockpiling of strategic resources, efforts to prop up friendly governments in producing countries, as well as support to multinational companies and favorable international agreements. Traditional Western strategic thinking remained concerned with access to supplies, which might be threatened by the Soviet Union. A particular concern was Western control of oil in the Gulf and strategic minerals in southern and central Africa. After the end of the Cold War and the disintegration of the Soviet Union, the security of supply continues to worry government and business decisions with regard to several minerals, in particular radioactive materials. However, oil continues to be the most important resource in global strategy. The global economy relied on oil for much of the 20th century as a portable and indispensable fuel. The immense wealth associated with oil generates political struggles to control it, and the history of petroleum is also the history of war and struggle. Nowhere is this more obviously the case than in West Asia and Central Asia. West Asia, specifically the Gulf region, accounts for about 30% of global oil production. But it has about 64% of the planet's known reserves, and is therefore the only region able to satisfy any substantial rise in oil demand. Saudi Arabia has a quarter of the world's total reserves and is the single largest producer. Iraq's known reserves are second only to Saudi Arabia's. And, since substantial portions of Iraqi territory are yet to be fully explored, there is a fair chance that actual reserves might be far larger. The United States, Europe, Japan, and increasingly India and China, which consume this petroleum, are located at a considerable distance from the region. Water is another crucial resource that is relevant to global politics. Regional variations and the increasing scarcity of fresh water in some parts of the world point to the possibility of disagreements over shared water resources as a leading source of conflicts in the 21st century. Some commentators on world politics have referred to water wars to describe the possibility of violent conflict over this life-sustaining resource. Countries that share rivers can disagree over many things. For instance, a typical disagreement is a downstream, lower riparian state's objection to pollution, excessive irrigation, or the construction of dams by an upstream, upper riparian state, which might decrease or degrade the quality of water available to the downstream state. States have used force to protect or seize freshwater resources. Examples of violence include those between Israel, Syria, and Jordan in the 1950s and 1960s over attempts by each side to divert water from the Jordan and Yarmouk rivers, and more recent threats between Turkey, Syria, and Iraq over the construction of dams on the Euphrates River. A number of studies show that countries that share rivers, and many countries do share rivers, are involved in military conflicts with each other. The indigenous peoples and their rights. The question of indigenous people brings the issues of environment, resources and politics together. The UN defines indigenous populations as comprising the descendants of peoples who inhabited the present territory of a country at the time when persons of a different culture or ethnic origin arrived there from other parts of the world and overcame them. Indigenous people today live more in conformity with their particular social, economic, and cultural customs and traditions than the institutions of the country of which they now form a part. In the context of world politics, what are the common interests of approximately 30 crore indigenous peoples spread throughout the world including India? There are 20 lakh indigenous people of the Cordillera region of the Philippines, 10 lakh Mapuche people of Chile, 6 lakh tribal people of the Chittagong Hill Tracts in Bangladesh, 35 lakh North American natives, 50,000 Kuna living east of Panama Canal and 10 lakh small peoples of the Soviet North. Like other social movements, indigenous people speak of their struggles, their agenda and their rights. The indigenous voices in world politics call for the admission of indigenous people to the world community as equals. Indigenous people occupy areas in Central and South America, Africa, India, where they are known as tribals, and Southeast Asia. Many of the present-day island states in the Oceania region, including Australia and New Zealand, were inhabited by the Polynesian, Melanesian and Micronesian people over the course of thousands of years. They appeal to governments to come to terms with the continuing existence of indigenous nations as enduring communities with an identity of their own. Since times immemorial, is the phrase used by indigenous people all over the world to refer to their continued occupancy of the lands from which they originate. The worldviews of indigenous societies, irrespective of their geographical location, are strikingly similar with respect to land and the variety of life systems supported by it. The loss of land, which also means the loss of an economic resource base, is the most obvious threat to the survival of indigenous people. Can political autonomy be enjoyed without its attachment to the means of physical survival? In India, the description, indigenous people, is usually applied to the scheduled tribes who constitute nearly 8% of the population of the country. With the exception of small communities of hunters and gatherers, most indigenous populations in India depend for their subsistence primarily on the cultivation of land. For centuries, if not millennia, they had free access to as much land as they could cultivate. It was only after the establishment of the British colonial rule that areas, which had previously been inhabited by the scheduled tribe communities, were subjected to outside forces. Although they enjoy a constitutional protection in political representation, they have not got much of the benefits of development in the country. In fact, they have paid a huge cost for development since they are the single largest group among the people displaced by various developmental projects since independence. Issues related to the rights of the indigenous communities have been neglected in domestic and international politics for very long. During the 1970s, growing international contacts among indigenous leaders from around the world aroused a sense of common concern and shared experiences. The World Council of Indigenous Peoples was formed in 1975. The council became subsequently the first of 11 indigenous NGOs to receive consultative status in the UN. Many of the movements against globalization, discussed in Chapter 9, have focused on the rights of the indigenous people. Around the Aral Sea, thousands of people have had to leave their homes as the toxic waters have totally destroyed the fishing industry. The shipping industry and all related activities have collapsed. Rising concentrations of salt in the soil have caused low crop yields. Numerous studies have been conducted. In fact, locals joke that if everyone who had come to study the Aral had brought a bucket of water, the sea would be full by now. Source: www. Gobar Times, Org Antarctica. The Antarctic continental region extends over 14 million square kilometers and comprises 26% of the world's wilderness area, representing 90% of all terrestrial ice and 70% of planetary fresh water. The Antarctic also extends to a further 36 million square kilometers of ocean. It has a limited terrestrial life and a highly productive marine ecosystem, comprising a few plants, e.g. microscopic algae, fungi and lichen, marine mammals, fish and hordes of birds adapted to harsh conditions, as well as the krill, which is central to marine food chain and upon which other animals are dependent. The Antarctic plays an important role in maintaining climatic equilibrium, and deep ice cores provide an important source of information about greenhouse gas concentrations and atmospheric temperatures of hundreds and thousands of years ago. Who owns this coldest, farthest, and windiest continent on globe? There are two claims about it. Some countries like the UK, Argentina, Chile, Norway, France, Australia and New Zealand have made legal claims to sovereign rights over Antarctic territory. Most other states have taken the opposite view that the Antarctic is a part of the global commons and not subject to the exclusive jurisdiction of any state. These differences, however, have not prevented the adoption of innovative and potentially far-reaching rules for the protection of the Antarctic environment and its ecosystem. The Antarctic and the Arctic polar regions are subjected to special regional rules of environmental protection. Since 1959, activities in the area have been limited to scientific research, fishing and tourism. Even these limited activities have not prevented parts of the region from being degraded by waste as a result of oil spills. Sacred groves in India. Protecting nature for religious reasons is an ancient practice in many traditional societies. Sacred groves in India, parcels of uncut forest vegetation in the name of certain deities or natural or ancestral spirits, exemplify such practice. As a model of community-based resource management, groves have lately gained attention in conservation literature. The sacred groves can be seen as a system that informally forces traditional communities to harvest natural resources in an ecologically sustained fashion. Some researchers believe that sacred groves hold the potential for preserving not only biodiversity and ecological functions, but also cultural diversity. Sacred groves embody a rich set of forest preservation practices and they share characteristics with common property resource systems. Their size ranges from clumps of a few trees to several hundred acres. Traditionally, sacred groves have been valued for their embodied spiritual and cultural attributes. Hindus commonly worshipped natural objects, including trees and groves. Many temples have originated from sacred groves. Deep religious reverence for nature, rather than resource scarcity, seems to be the basis for the long-standing commitment to preserving these forests. In recent years, however, expansion and human settlement have slowly encroached on sacred forests. In many places, the institutional identity of these traditional forests is fading with the advent of new national forest policies. A real problem in managing sacred groves arises when legal ownership and operational control are held by different entities. The two entities in question, the state and the community, vary in their policy norms and underlying motives for using the sacred grove. Are forests wilderness? What distinguishes the forest movements of the South from those of the North is that the forests of the former are still peopled, whilst the forests of the latter are more or less devoid of human habitat or, at least, are perceived as thus. This explains to some extent the prevailing notion of wilderness in the North as a wild place where people do not live. In this perspective, humans are not seen as part of nature. In other words, environment is perceived as somewhere out there, as something that should be protected from humans through the creation of parks and reserves. On the other hand, most environmental issues in the South are based on the assumption that people live in the forests. Wilderness-oriented perspectives have been predominant in Australia, Scandinavia, North America and New Zealand. In these regions, there are still large tracts of relatively underdeveloped wilderness, unlike in most European countries. This is not to say that wilderness campaigns are entirely missing in the South. In the Philippines, green organizations fight to protect eagles and other birds of prey from extinction. In India, a battle goes on to protect the alarmingly low number of Bengal tigers. In Africa, a long campaign has been waged against the ivory trade and the savage slaughter of elephants. Some of the most famous wilderness struggles have been fought in the forests of Brazil and Indonesia. All of these campaigns focus on individual species as well as the conservation of the wilderness habitats, which support them. Many of the wilderness issues have been renamed biodiversity issues in recent times, as the concept of wilderness has been proved difficult to sell in the South. Many of these campaigns have been initiated and funded by NGOs such as the Worldwide Wildlife Fund, WWF, in association with local people. Everyone is playing crude. The list of petroleum-based products in our lives is endless. Toothbrush, pacemaker, paints, inks. Oil provides the energy for 95% of the world's transportation needs. The whole industrialized world survives on petroleum. We cannot imagine living without it. There are billions of barrels of it under the earth for us to use. Yet there are disputes between countries. Why, here is one of the problems. I belong to the royal family of the Kingdom of Black Gold. I am what they call filthy rich. Ever since black gold was found in my kingdom, things have never been the same again. Mr. Big Oil and his government came prospecting one day. We struck oil, in a deal. They armed me to the teeth till it hurt. So when I grin, my subjects look at me with awe. In return, Big Oil and Sons get to buy all my oil and loyalty. I am happy and rich, and so are they. I turn my blind eye to their military in this holy land. I value precious things. Big Oil says his president values freedom and democracy. So I keep both safely under lock and key in my land. Sheikh Petrodollah, king of the land of black gold, as advised, I did ask myself, what can I do for my country? My country has an enormous appetite for oil. So, provide it with oil, of course. I believe in the free market system. Free to dig up oil in faraway countries, free to create pliable tin pot dictators to keep local populations at bay, and free to destroy ecology. We play no politics but pay them at election campaigns and get them to invest in our company. That way we do not have to embarrass ourselves. Mr. Big Oil, CEO of Big Oil and Sons, leading the good life. A new beauty is parked outside our garage. Awesome. Is not it? Sleek chrome finish, power steering, automatic gears. Excellent pickup and great mileage too. It is low on emissions too, gentle on the atmosphere, you know. Global warming and all that stuff. Now we really are in hurry to zoom off and lead the good life. God save everyone. Veruam MMM. Mr. and Mrs. Gobbledo terrorists loose cannonballs. Toppleton defends freedom and democracy. That is why he is so generous with guns and missiles. Like the ones he gave us to fight the invading ruffians. He even trained us. We did not realize that it was the oil they were after. Big Oil is always trying to woo us. But we are too busy playing war games. Now we have rules of our own. Toppleton's Gov. Kept changing its rules. Not fair, we said. Some of us now hate Toppleton, his government and his people. Of course their bullets and missiles come in handy when we have to beat them at their game. Make no mistake, we are terrorists. Chapter 9, Globalization. Overview. In this final chapter of the book we look at globalization, something that has been referred to in many chapters of this book and textbooks of many other subjects. We begin by analyzing the concept of globalization and then examine its causes. We then discuss at length the political, economic and cultural consequences of globalization. Our interest is also in studying the impact of globalization on India as well as how India is affecting globalization. We finally draw attention to resistance to globalization and how social movements in India also form part of this resistance. The concept of globalization. Janardhan works in a call center. He leaves late in the evening for work, becomes John when he enters his office, acquires a new accent and speaks a different language than he does when he is at home, to communicate with his clients who are living thousands of miles away. He works all night, which is actually daytime for his overseas customers. Janardhan is rendering a service to somebody who in all probability he is never likely to meet physically. This is his daily routine. His holidays also do not correspond to the Indian calendar but to those of his clients who happen to be from the US. Ramdari has gone shopping to buy a birthday gift for his 90-year-old daughter. He has promised her a small cycle and decides to search the market for something he finds affordable as well as of reasonable quality. He finally does buy a cycle, which is actually manufactured in China but is being marketed in India. It meets his requirements of quality as well as affordability, and Ramdari decides to go ahead with his purchase. Last year, Ramdari on his daughter's insistence had bought her a Barbie doll, which was originally manufactured in the US but was being sold in India. Sarika is a first-generation learner who has done remarkably well throughout her school and college life by working very hard. She now has an opportunity to take on a job and begin an independent career, which the women of her family had never dreamt of earlier. While some of her relatives are opposed, she finally decides to go ahead because of the new opportunities that have been made available to her generation. All three examples illustrate an aspect each of what we call globalization. In the first instance, Janardhan was participating in the globalization of services. Ramdari's birthday purchases tell us something about the movement of commodities from one part of the world to another. Sarika is faced with a conflict of values partly originating from a new opportunity that earlier was not available to the women in her family but today is part of a reality that has gained wider acceptability. If we look for examples of the use of the term, globalization, in real life, we will realize that it is used in various contexts. Let us look at some examples, different from the ones that we have looked above. Some farmers committed suicide because their crops failed. They had bought very expensive seeds supplied by a multinational company, MNC. An Indian company bought a major rival company based in Europe, despite protests by some of the current owners. Many retail shopkeepers fear that they would lose their livelihoods if some major international companies open retail chains in the country. A film producer in Mumbai was accused of lifting the story of his film from another film made in Hollywood. A militant group issued a statement threatening college girls who wear Western clothes. These examples show us that globalization need not always be positive, it can have negative consequences for the people. Indeed, there are many who believe that globalization has more negative consequences than positive. These examples also show us that globalization need not be only about the economic issues, nor is the direction of influence always from the rich to the poor countries. Since much of the usage tends to be imprecise, it becomes important to clarify what we mean by globalization. Globalization as a concept fundamentally deals with flows. These flows could be of various kinds, ideas moving from one part of the world to another, capital shunted between two or more places, commodities being traded across borders, and people moving in search of better livelihoods to different parts of the world. The crucial element is the worldwide interconnectedness that is created and sustained as a consequence of these constant flows. Globalization is a multidimensional concept. It has political, economic and cultural manifestations, and these must be adequately distinguished. It is wrong to assume that globalization has purely economic dimensions, just as it would also be mistaken to assume that it is a purely cultural phenomenon. The impact of globalization is vastly uneven, it affects some societies more than others and some parts of some societies more than others, and it is important to avoid drawing general conclusions about the impact of globalization without paying sufficient attention to specific contexts. Causes of globalization. What accounts for globalization? If globalization is about the flows of ideas, capital, commodities, and people, it is perhaps logical to ask if there is anything novel about this phenomenon. Globalization in terms of these four flows along has taken place through much of human history. However, those who argue that there is something distinct about contemporary globalization point out that it is the scale and speed of these flows that account for the uniqueness of globalization in the contemporary era. Globalization has a strong historical basis, and it is important to view contemporary flows against this backdrop. While globalization is not caused by any single factor, technology remains a critical element. There is no doubt that the invention of the telegraph, the telephone, and the microchip in more recent times has revolutionized communication between actors in different parts of the world. When printing initially came into being, it laid the basis for the creation of nationalism. So also today we should expect that technology will affect the way we think of our personal but also our collective lives. The ability of ideas, capital, commodities and people to move more easily from one part of the world to another has been made possible largely by technological advances. The pace of these flows may vary. For instance, the movement of capital and commodities will most likely be quicker and wider than the movement of peoples across different parts of the world. Globalization, however, does not emerge merely because of the availability of improved communications. What is important is for people in different parts of the world to recognize these interconnections with the rest of the world. Currently, we are aware of the fact that events taking place in one part of the world could have an impact on another part of the world. The bird flu or tsunami is not confined to any particular nation. It does not respect national boundaries. Similarly, when major economic events take place, their impact is felt outside their immediate local, national or regional environment at the global level. Political consequences. One of the debates that has been generated as a consequence of contemporary processes of globalization relates to its ongoing political impact. How does globalization affect traditional conceptions of state sovereignty? There are at least 3 aspects that we need to consider when answering this question. At the most simple level, globalization results in an erosion of state capacity, that is, the ability of government to do what they do. All over the world, the old, welfare state is now giving way to a more minimalist state that performs certain core functions such as the maintenance of law and order and the security of its citizens. However, it withdraws from many of its earlier welfare functions directed at economic and social well-being. In place of the welfare state, it is the market that becomes the prime determinant of economic and social priorities. The entry and the increased role of multinational companies all over the world leads to a reduction in the capacity of governments to take decisions on their own. At the same time, globalization does not always reduce state capacity. The primacy of the state continues to be the unchallenged basis of political community. The old jealousies and rivalries between countries have not ceased to matter in world politics. The state continues to discharge its essential functions, law and order, national security, and consciously withdraws from certain domains from which it wishes to. States continue to be important. Indeed, in some respects state capacity has received a boost as a consequence of globalization, with enhanced technologies available at the disposal of the state to collect information about its citizens. With this information, the state is better able to rule, not less able. Thus, states become more powerful than they were earlier as an outcome of the new technology. Economic consequences. While everything may not be known about the economic facets of globalization, this particular dimension shapes a large part of the content and direction of contemporary debates surrounding globalization. A part of the problem has to do with defining economic globalization itself. The mention of economic globalization draws our attention immediately to the role of international institutions like the IMF and the WTO and the role they play in determining economic policies across the world. Yet, globalization must not be viewed in such narrow terms. Economic globalization involves many actors other than these international institutions. A much broader way of understanding of economic globalization requires us to look at the distribution of economic gains, i.e., who gets the most from globalization and who gets less, indeed who loses from it. What is often called economic globalization usually involves greater economic flows among different countries of the world. Some of this is voluntary and some forced by international institutions and powerful countries. As we saw in the examples at the beginning of this chapter, this flow or exchange can take various forms: commodities, capital, people and ideas. Globalization has involved greater trade in commodities across the globe. The restrictions imposed by different countries on allowing the imports of other countries have been reduced. Similarly, the restrictions on movement of capital across countries have also been reduced. In operational terms, it means that investors in the rich countries can invest their money in countries other than their own, including developing countries, where they might get better returns. Globalization has also led to the flow of ideas across national boundaries. The spread of internet and computer-related services is an example of that. But globalization has not led to the same degree of increase in the movement of people across the globe. Developed countries have carefully guarded their borders with visa policies to ensure that citizens of other countries cannot take away the jobs of their own citizens. In thinking about the consequences of globalization, it is necessary to keep in mind that the same set of policies do not lead to the same results everywhere. While globalization has led to similar economic policies adopted by governments in different parts of the world, this has generated vastly different outcomes in different parts of the world. It is again crucial to pay attention to specific context rather than make simple generalizations in this connection. Economic globalization has created an intense division of opinion all over the world. Those who are concerned about social justice are worried about the extent of state withdrawal caused by processes of economic globalization. They point out that it is likely to benefit only a small section of the population while impoverishing those who were dependent on the government for jobs and welfare, education, health, sanitation, etc. They have emphasized the need to ensure institutional safeguards are creating social safety nets to minimize the negative effects of globalization on those who are economically weak. Many movements all over the world feel that safety nets are insufficient or unworkable. They have called for a halt to forced economic globalization, for its results would lead to economic ruin for the weaker countries, especially for the poor within these countries. Some economists have described economic globalization as recolonization of the world. Advocates of economic globalization argue that it generates greater economic growth and well-being for larger sections of the population when there is deregulation. Greater trade among countries allows each economy to do what it does best. This would benefit the whole world. They also argue that economic globalization is inevitable and it is not wise to resist the march of history. More moderate supporters of globalization say that globalization provides a challenge that can be responded to intelligently without accepting it uncritically. What, however, cannot be denied is the increased momentum towards interdependence and integration between governments, businesses, and ordinary people in different parts of the world as a result of globalization. Cultural consequences. The consequences of globalization are not confined only to the sphere of politics and economy. Globalization affects us in our home, in what we eat, drink, wear, and indeed in what we think. It shapes what we think are our preferences. The cultural effect of globalization leads to the fear that this process poses a threat to cultures in the world. It does so, because globalization leads to the rise of a uniform culture or what is called cultural homogenization. The rise of uniform culture is not the emergence of global culture. What we have in the name of a global culture is the imposition of Western culture on the rest of the world. We have already studied this phenomenon as the soft power of its hegemony in Chapter 3. The popularity of a burger or blue jeans, some argue, has a lot to do with the powerful influence of the American way of life. Thus, the culture of the politically and economically dominant society leaves its imprint on a less powerful society, and the world begins to look more like the dominant power wishes it to be. Those who make this argument often draw attention to the McDonaldization of the world, with cultures seeking to buy into the dominant American dream. This is dangerous not only for the poor countries but for the whole of humanity, for it leads to the shrinking of the rich cultural heritage of the entire globe. At the same time, it would be a mistake to assume that cultural consequences of globalization are only negative. Cultures are not static things. All cultures accept outside influences all the time. Some external influences are negative because they reduce our choices. But sometimes external influences simply enlarge our choices, and sometimes they modify our culture without overwhelming the traditional. The burger is no substitute for a masala dosa and, therefore, does not pose any real challenge. It is simply added onto our food choices. Blue jeans, on the other hand, can go well with a homespun khadi kurta. Here the outcome of outside influence is a new combination that is unique, a khadi kurta worn over jeans. Interestingly, this clothing combination has been exported back to the country that gave us blue jeans so that it is possible to see young Americans wearing a kurta and jeans. While cultural homogenization is an aspect of globalization, the same process also generates precisely the opposite effect. It leads to each culture becoming more different and distinctive. This phenomenon is called cultural heterogenization. This is not to deny that there remain differences in power when cultures interact, but instead more fundamentally to suggest that cultural exchange is rarely one way. India and globalization. We said earlier that globalization has occurred in earlier periods in history in different parts of the world. Flows pertaining to the movement of capital, commodities, ideas and people go back several centuries in Indian history. During the colonial period, as a consequence of Britain's imperial ambitions, India became an exporter of primary goods and raw materials and a consumer of finished goods. After independence, because of this experience with the British, we decided to make things ourselves rather than relying on others. We also decided not to allow others to export to us so that our own producers could learn to make things. This protectionism generated its own problems. While some advances were made in certain arenas, critical sectors such as health, housing and primary education did not receive the attention they deserved. India had a fairly sluggish rate of economic growth. In 1991, responding to a financial crisis and to the desire for higher rates of economic growth, India embarked on a program of economic reforms that has sought increasingly to deregulate various sectors including trade and foreign investment. While it may be too early to say how good this has been for India, the ultimate test is not high growth rates as making sure that the benefits of growth are shared so that everyone is better off. Resistance to globalization. We have already noted that globalization is a very contentious subject and has invited strong criticism all over the globe. Critics of globalization make a variety of arguments. Those on the left argue that contemporary globalization represents a particular phase of global capitalism that makes the rich richer and fewer and the poor poorer. Weakening of the state leads to a reduction in the capacity of the state to protect the interest of its poor. Critics of globalization from the political right express anxiety over the political, economic and cultural effects. In political terms, they also fear the weakening of the state. Economically, they want a return to self-reliance and protectionism, at least in certain areas of the economy. Culturally, they are worried that traditional culture will be harmed and people will lose their age-old values and ways. It is important to note here that anti-globalization movements too participate in global networks, allying with those who feel like them in other countries. Many anti-globalization movements are not opposed to the idea of globalization per se as much as they are opposed to a specific program of globalization, which they see as a form of imperialism. In 1999, at the World Trade Organization (WTO) ministerial meeting, there were widespread protests at Seattle alleging unfair trading practices by the economically powerful states. It was argued that the interests of the developing world were not given sufficient importance in the evolving global economic system. The World Social Forum, WSF, is another global platform, which brings together a wide coalition composed of human rights activists, environmentalists, labor, youth and women activists opposed to neoliberal globalization. The first WSF meeting was organized in Porto Alegre, Brazil in 2001. The fourth WSF meeting was held in Mumbai in 2004. The seventh WSF meeting was held in Nairobi, Kenya in January 2007. India and resistance to globalization. What has been India's experience in resisting globalization? Social movements play a role in helping people make sense of the world around them and finding ways to deal with matters that trouble them. Resistance to globalization in India has come from different quarters. There have been left-wing protests to economic liberalization voiced through political parties as well as through forums like the Indian Social Forum. Trade unions of industrial workforce as well as those representing farmer interests have organized protests against the entry of multinationals. The patenting of certain plants like neem by American and European firms has also generated considerable opposition. Resistance to globalization has also come from the political right. This has taken the form of objecting particularly to various cultural influences, ranging from the availability of foreign TV channels provided by cable networks, celebration of Valentine's Day, and westernization of the dress tastes of girl students in schools and colleges. Gosh, an Indian again. An insider's view of a call center job working in a call center, in fact, can be enlightening in its own way. As you handle calls from Americans, you get an insight into the true American culture. An average American comes out as more lively and honest than we imagine, however, not all calls and conversations are pleasant. You can also receive irate and abusive callers. Sometimes the hatred that they exhibit in their tone on knowing that their call has been routed to India is very stressful. Americans tend to perceive every Indian as one who has denied them their rightful job. One can receive a call, beginning on the lines of, "I spoke to a South African a few minutes ago and now I'm speaking to an Indian." Or, "Oh gosh, an Indian again. Connect me to an American please." It is difficult to find the right response in situations of this kind. Source: report by Shashi Tharoor in The Hindu, the 10th of January 2005. Document finished.